and physical and spiritual death entered the world, the two penalties for sin. Now this sort of idea is strengthened, of course, by the Book of Mormon, but it can be found originally in Genesis, where there are the two penalties for sin mentioned. And so once we recognize these two penalties for sin, the scapegoat becomes a little bit more interpretable, because we see one goat dying for the sins of the people and the other being expelled for the sins of the people. These are the two penalties for sin that come from the fall, being atoned on the Day of Atonement. I don't know why sometimes this doesn't go forward. The next one that's interesting to me, at least, is Cain and Abel. Here we have two brothers, just like before, who are told to sacrifice. One brings the fruit of the ground, one brings the lamb. One's accepted, the other is not. One's chosen, the other is not. One is chosen, and they fight, and one is killed, and the other is cast out. One brother dies, and the other is cast out. And fascinatingly enough, the one who's cast out is identified with perdition, the devil. And the one who's slain is identified with Christ, wrongly. You've noticed the JST. If you read the JST on these passages, it says, some people believed wrongly that Abel was slain for sins, possibly because they recognized him as a type of Christ. So some people actually thought he died literally for sins, which the JST says is a wrong interpretation, but at least one is being identified with Christ, the other with Satan or the devil. The other really fun one is Isaac and Ishmael. We have here two brothers, and one of the mother laughs at Sarah, and they say, well, we should... anyway, there's an altercation that goes on, and Abraham casts one of the children, Ishmael, out into the wilderness, and we get a repetition of the phrase wilderness. It also shows up in the scapegoat ritual. And the other is chosen later to die. You remember the issue with Abraham sacrificing his son upon the mountain. Of course, if we come to Isaac being sacrificed, we get another variation on the theme. Here his son is about to be sacrificed, and he's replaced by the lamb, who's caught in the thicket and is sacrificed in his stead. But in this case, Isaac isn't banished, he's set free. So through the death of the first goat, the second goat, Isaac, is set free, which is a very different pattern than we had before. At first they were being banished, now they're being set free. Joseph and the goat. You'll remember Joseph and his Technicolor dream coat? Well, Joseph is one of these interesting individuals who his brothers wanted to kill. You remember, selling him wasn't their first plan. Their first plan was to kill him. And Reuben, I believe it was, comes and says, no, let's not kill Joseph. He's a nice guy. Let's sell him instead, and we'll take his coat. No, Reuben wants to save him, and Judah says, no, let's sell him instead. And they sell him for 20 pieces of silver, this magic price of a slave in his day, versus the 30 pieces of silver that Christ was sold for, which is the price of a slave in his age. And to make this work, they have to convince his father that he was killed. So does anyone remember how they do this? They take his coat of colors and they sacrifice a goat, or they kill a goat, and they take its blood and dip it on the coat, and they bring it before his father, and they take this coat and they show it to his father, and his father says, my son has been slain. And so in this fascinating way, the goat died so that Joseph didn't have to die. He got to be sold instead, sort of exiled into the wilderness. We also, of course, have, and this is probably my second most powerful parallel, is Christ and Barabbas. They stand before Pilate. And when Christ and Barabbas stood before Pilate, he brought them both forward, and you remember it was a feast day, and they were supposed to release one prisoner to the Jews, and he said, whom shall I release unto you? Barabbas' Aramaic word means the son of the father, Barabbas. So here we have two sons of the father brought before a judge, Pilate, who asks the people, whom shall I release unto you? And they say, release unto us Barabbas. So he lets Barabbas go, and they choose and select Christ to be slain. One released, one slain. Of course, Barabbas was a murderer. And what's interesting about this, once you start getting into it, you notice that these sorts of stories repeat over and over and over again. And there's a lot more of them than we've done here today. There's thousands of stories in the Old Testament that tie into these sorts of themes. For example, the Exodus. The firstborn Egyptians are slain so the Israelites can go free. Or the lamb is slain so the firstborn Israelites don't have to die. So the lamb dies in the stead of the Israelites. The Egyptians die so the Israelites can go free. In Leviticus 14 is the ritual for the cleansing of a leper. And in Leviticus 14, they take 2 birds instead of 2 goats. And they tie them with hyssop and thread, some of the same things they use to kill the goats, and they sprinkle blood on the individual to cleanse him of leprosy. One bird is killed, the other bird is let go. And the imagery in it is over an open field. Whereas the scapegoat is banished, the bird in Leviticus could be seen as being banished, but it's also ambiguous. This is another one of those places where people disagree. Is the image of the bird flying free the image of one individual being released alive through the death of the other? Or is it the image of both banishment and death being suffered so that the man can be set free, cleansed of his leprosy? And we have these rituals that we don't know exactly how to interpret them, and there's a lot of ambiguity in them. But Leviticus 14 certainly has a lot of parallels with Exodus. There's also some Babylonian temple rituals. There's a Babylonian temple ritual specifically for cleansing the temple, so it has the same purpose as the Day of Atonement. And what they did is they took a single goat, and it's really fascinating the literalness of it. They killed the goat, so it died, and then they took its body and wiped it on the walls of the temple like it was a bar of soap. And like a magnet, it accumulated all the impurities. And then they threw it into a river, and it was washed downriver and thereby exiled from the people. So it took the impurities from the temple, and it was a mechanism for moving the impurities out into the wilderness. And so some people have seen in the scapegoat this same mechanism for moving the impurities of the temple out into the wilderness. The difference, of course, is in the Israelite case, the priest specifically confesses the sins of the people on its head, as if he knows, or the Israelites have a concept that the impurities come from our unrighteous acts. And it's those impurities that he transfers to the head of the goat instead of just kind of the impurities on the temple wall. They don't use it like a bar of soap. Of course, we've also got Levitical substitution, which is just a fancy way of saying when the Levites serve in the temple, it's the firstborn of all of Israel who are supposed to serve, but the Levites represent and are substitutes for the firstborn. So the Levites get to go to the temple and serve, and all the rest of Israel gets to go free and not have to go and do the service of the temple because the Levites are their substitute, taking their place. Again, there's lots of these, and my point in pointing out these last few is just to give you the general idea that there's a lot of things we could look at that all have a lot of things in common with this sort of substitution. So what I'd like to do to interpret this is put up this really fancy-dancy table. And you'll notice something about it. The first thing we'd like to know is, does the scapegoat represent an escape? Remember I said we didn't know which the bird represents? Does the scapegoat represent an escape? The scapegoat going free because of the death of the first goat? Or does it represent something else? And if we just put up the table, the first thing you notice is it's about evenly divided. There's some that represent an escape, like the baker and the butcher, the Levites, the firstborn Egyptians, the firstborn lamb. These all represent escapes. Christ and Barabbas. Barabbas is set free because of the death of Christ. Joseph and the goat, both a banishment and an escape. And then there's a long list of ones that represent banishment. So that wasn't terribly helpful. And what we were hoping is that these parallels would help us interpret this. And once we provided the parallels, all the problems would go away. And that's not what we're noticing. Next, for example, did the scapegoat sin? So was he banished because of his sins, like Satan was? Or did he represent a substitute, being banished for our sins? And so you'll notice the individuals that were banished, all, except for 2, either sinned themselves or carried the sins of another. It's interesting. But you'll notice those that escaped, almost all of them, weren't specific sin associated with their actions. We'd also like to find this concept of death, because you notice there's that one dies and one is set free. And so you'll notice almost all of these stories have something that dies as well as something that's set free. And a large percentage of them actually mention the wilderness where the scapegoat was cast into. So what in the world are we to make of all of this? When we're all done, we're not really any closer, it seems like, because these parallels didn't definitively come down on one side or the other. We can't turn to the parallels and say, there's no doubt that the scapegoat represents Christ. We can't turn to the parallels and say, there's no doubt that the scapegoat represents Satan. My proposed solution to this, and it comes from the parallels. Once we put all the parallels down, I think something becomes clear, and that is that God is trying to teach some principles. So I may not be able to interpret the scapegoat, but I can interpret the principles from the stories that surround it. And so what principles are taught in all of these stories? in all of them we see some sort of substitution being taught. So God wants his people to know and understand that through the substitution of another, they